So Donald Trump just signed an executive order attempting to seize control of Great Lakes shipping, a $903 billion framework that would give American vessels priority navigation through shared waterways, restructure tolls in America's favor, and claim first right of access to cargo transiting through waters that have been jointly governed by the United States and Canada for over 116 years. Canada's response was delivered within 48 hours. And it wasn't a diplomatic protest. It wasn't a sternly worded letter. Mark Carney activated a series of geographic and legal countermeasures that are now threatening to shut down the economic lifeline of the entire American Midwest, the iron ore that makes American steel, the grain that feeds American exports, and the automotive supply chain that keeps Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana employed. Warren Buffett, whose railroad and energy investments depend on Great Lakes commerce, said he hasn't seen a president make a strategic error of this magnitude since, and this is a direct quote, since the last time someone tried to claim sovereignty over water that isn't theirs. But here's what most people don't understand about the Great Lakes. They're not just lakes. They are the single most critical commercial waterway in North America. More tonnage passes through the Soo Locks at Sault Ste. Marie than through the Panama and Suez Canals combined. And half of that waterway system, the locks, the channels, the icebreakers that keep it open in winter, is controlled by Canada. Subscribe now, because what happened next is going to reshape how you understand the American Midwest's economy. Let me explain why the Great Lakes matter so much, because most people have no idea what's actually moving through those waters. The Great Lakes contain 21% of the world's surface freshwater. They are the largest freshwater system on the face of the earth. 4 of the 5 Great Lakes form the international boundary between the United States and Canada, and the Great Lakes St. Lawrence Seaway system stretches 2,300 miles from Duluth, Minnesota, all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. 40 million people in both countries depend on this system for drinking water. These aren't lakes in the way most people think of lakes. This is an inland sea system larger than the entire United Kingdom. But the water isn't what makes them strategically critical. The commerce is. The Soo Locks at Sault Ste. Marie, a small city that straddles the Michigan-Ontario border, are the single most critical choke point in North American commerce. More tonnage passes through those locks every year than through the Panama Canal and the Suez Canal combined. Let that register. A set of locks that most Americans have never heard of and a city most Americans couldn't find on a map handles more cargo than the 2 most famous shipping corridors on the planet. The Department of Homeland Security has classified the Soo Locks as the most critical infrastructure asset in the United States, more critical than any single bridge, any single highway, any single port. If the Soo Locks shut down for even a few weeks, the American steel industry collapses. That's not hyperbole, that's a DHS assessment. 80% of American iron ore moves by Great Lakes freighter from Minnesota's Iron Range to steel mills in Gary, Indiana, Cleveland, Ohio, and Detroit, Michigan. The ore comes out of the ground in the Mesabi Range, gets loaded onto massive lake freighters at ports in Duluth and 2 harbors, and travels through Lake Superior, through the Soo Locks, through Lake Huron, and into the lower lakes where the steel mills are waiting. Without that route, there is no American steel industry. Not in its current form, not at its current scale. The economics of trucking or railing that volume of iron ore are prohibitive. The lakes are the only viable path. Hundreds of millions of bushels of wheat, corn, and soybeans from the upper Midwest are exported through the seaway to global markets every year. The grain moves from farm to elevator to port to freighter to the seaway and out to the Atlantic. Automotive parts cross the lakes between American and Canadian plants as many as 8 times during the assembly of a single vehicle. Engines, transmissions, stampings, electronics crossing back and forth between Ontario and Michigan in a choreographed supply chain that depends on frictionless transit. Coal, limestone, salt, petroleum products, the raw materials of Midwestern industry, all moving by water, all depending on a system that both nations have shared peacefully for more than a century. Shut down Great Lakes shipping, and you shut down the Midwest. Steel production drops. Auto plants idle. Grain rots in silos waiting for ships that can't move. Power plants that rely on coal delivered by lake freighter face fuel shortages. Construction projects that need limestone and aggregate lose their supply. It's that simple and that devastating. The Great Lakes aren't scenery. They're the circulatory system of the American heartland. And this system has worked continuously, reliably, productively because of a single principle established by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. Shared water means shared authority. The treaty, one of the oldest international agreements in the Western Hemisphere, guarantees equal navigation rights to both nations. The International Joint Commission, with representatives from both countries, oversees the shared waterways. The St. Lawrence Seaway, which is the only route connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, is jointly operated, with Canadian-controlled locks that serve as the gateway for every vessel entering or leaving the system. The SO locks sit on the border. The American side handles the majority of commercial traffic, but the Canadian side controls half the waterway, including the Canadian lock and the approaches from the Canadian Channel. For 116 years, this arrangement has survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the Cold War, and every trade dispute these 2 countries have ever had. No president on either side has ever tried to claim unilateral control over the shared system. Until now. Here's what Trump signed. The executive order, which he issued unilaterally without consulting Congress, without notifying the International Joint Commission, and without informing Canada, contains 6 provisions that legal scholars are calling the most significant unilateral claim over shared waters since the Cold War. Provision 1. American Priority Navigation. American-flagged vessels receive priority transit through the entire Great Lakes Seaway system. That includes Canadian-controlled locks and channels. Canadian commercial vessels are relegated to secondary scheduling. American ships go first, even through Canadian locks that Canadian taxpayers built and Canadian workers operate. Provision 2. Toll restructuring. Seaway tolls restructured, so American vessels pay 40% less than current rates, while Canadian and international vessels pay 25% more. America gets a discount on infrastructure it didn't build and doesn't maintain. Canada and the rest of the world subsidize that discount. Provision 3. Port exclusivity zones. Certain Great Lakes port facilities designated as American priority zones where American cargo receives guaranteed berth allocation, dock time, and loading priority. Some of these ports handle Canadian cross-border trade. Trump is claiming priority access at facilities that serve Canadian industry. Provision 4. Resource transit claims. This is the one that made international lawyers' jaws drop. American first right of purchase on any cargo transiting the Great Lakes system, regardless of origin or destination. If Canadian iron ore is being shipped through the seaway to Japan, American buyers can invoke priority and intercept it at the port of transit. If European-bound grain is moving through Canadian waters, American buyers can claim first access. That's not trade policy. That's piracy with a legal vocabulary. It's claiming the right to take other countries' cargo off boats in transit through shared international waterways. Provision 5. Infrastructure cost-sharing inversion. Canada required to fund 60% of all Seaway and Great Lakes infrastructure maintenance and upgrades, despite the framework giving America priority access and reduced tolls. Pay more, get less. That's the offer. Provision 6. Environmental waiver. Canada required to waive certain environmental review requirements for American shipping operations in shared waters. Weaken your own environmental protections on your own waterways for American commercial convenience. 6 provisions. Each one treating the Great Lakes as though they belong exclusively to the United States. Each one ignoring 116 years of shared governance. Each one violating the Boundary Waters Treaty that has kept these waters peaceful and productive since before either World War. The order was issued as a national economic security measure, the same legal framework Trump has used for tariffs, but legal scholars immediately pointed out that an executive order cannot override an international treaty ratified by the Senate. The Boundary Waters Treaty has the force of law. Constitutional law professors at Harvard, Yale, and Georgetown all independently called the order unconstitutional on its face. The American Society of International Law issued a rare formal statement calling it the most significant unilateral claim over shared international waters by any party to the Boundary Waters Treaty since its ratification. He didn't negotiate this. He didn't propose it through diplomatic channels. He didn't put it before Congress for review. He didn't notify the International Joint Commission, the body specifically created to oversee these exact waters. He signed it at his desk, presented it as done, and expected Canada to comply, as though shared waterways were his to claim by presidential signature, as though 116 years of international law were his to override with an executive order, as though geography itself, the physical location of Canadian locks, Canadian channels, Canadian icebreakers, would bend to a document signed in Washington. The international reaction was swift. The European Union expressed deep concern about unilateral claims over internationally shared waterways, explicitly noting the precedent-setting implications for shared water systems worldwide. Japan's foreign ministry issued a statement calling for respect for established international frameworks governing shared natural resources. And the International Joint Commission itself, the binational body that has overseen the Great Lakes since 1909, issued a rare public statement noting it was not consulted regarding this executive action and does not endorse unilateral measures by either party. Even members of his own party saw it for what it was. 8 U.S. senators from Great Lakes states, including 4 Republicans from Michigan, Ohio, Wisconsin, and Indiana, issued a joint bipartisan statement expressing serious concerns about the legal basis and economic implications of unilateral action over shared waterways when Republican senators from Michigan and Ohio start publicly questioning a Republican president's trade action when they put their names on a bipartisan statement alongside Democrats. You know the order has crossed a line that even partisan loyalty can't cover. These senators understand something the White House apparently doesn't. Their state's economies run on those lakes, and those lakes are half Canadian. Canada's response arrived in 48 hours, and it was devastating. Not because it was angry or emotional or retaliatory, because it was geographic. Canada didn't impose tariffs. Canada didn't threaten trade restrictions. Canada did something far more effective and far more unchallengeable. It exercised sovereign control over the physical infrastructure that makes the entire Great Lakes system function. Carney framed the response not as retaliation, but as the exercise of Canadian sovereign rights under international treaty law. That distinction is critical. Canada isn't retaliating against a trade action. Canada is enforcing a treaty, and treaty enforcement is legally unassailable. The first countermeasure hit the Seaway. The St. Lawrence Seaway, the only route connecting the Great Lakes to the Atlantic Ocean, runs through Canadian territory and Canadian-controlled locks. Canada announced enhanced security and environmental review protocols for all vessels transiting Canadian seaway infrastructure. The practical effect, transit times through the seaway increased by 24 to 72 hours per vessel. Inspections that previously took minutes now take hours. Environmental compliance documentation requirements tripled overnight. This isn't a blockade, it's a slowdown. And a slowdown on a shipping choke point has the same economic effect as a partial closure. For Midwest grain exporters who depend on timely seaway transit to meet international delivery contracts, the delays mean penalties, spoilage risk, and lost sales to competitors in South America and Australia who can deliver on time. For iron ore shipments heading to Great Lakes steel mills that operate on just-in-time delivery schedules, the delays mean production slowdowns and potential layoffs at mills that can't stockpile raw materials because the economics don't allow it. Canada didn't close the seaway, they slowed it down, and in shipping, time is money. A 48-hour delay on every vessel transiting the system costs the American Midwest an estimated $340 million per month. The second countermeasure hit the Soo locks. The Canadian side controls half the waterway at Sault Ste. Marie, including the Canadian lock and the approaches from the Canadian Channel. Canada announced scheduled maintenance reviews on the Canadian Channel, the kind of routine-sounding operational decision that reduces available transit capacity by an estimated 30 to 40%. 80% of American iron ore passes through the Soo locks. A 30 to 40% capacity reduction on the Canadian side means that 25 to 30% of iron ore shipments face delays, rerouting, or temporary storage at ports that don't have the capacity to hold them. Canada squeezed the Soo locks the way you squeeze an artery. They didn't cut it off, they restricted the flow, and the patient, the American steel industry, felt it within days. Steel mills in Gary, Cleveland, and Detroit operate on delivery schedules measured in hours, not weeks. When the iron ore doesn't arrive on time, the blast furnaces can't run at capacity. When the furnaces slow down, the workers go home. When the workers go home, the paychecks stop. The third countermeasure was the one that made defense analysts sit up straight. Canadian Coast Guard icebreakers maintain the winter shipping channels in the upper Great Lakes. Without icebreaking, the upper lakes Superior, Huron, and the northern reaches of Michigan are impassable from December through March. The ice on Lake Superior can reach 3 feet thick. Without icebreakers cutting channels through that ice, the massive lake freighters that carry iron ore and grain simply cannot move. They sit in port locked in until spring. Canada announced a reprioritization of icebreaking resources, shifting capacity toward Canadian domestic shipping lanes and away from U.S.-bound transit routes. The practical effect: the winter shipping season on the upper Great Lakes shortened by 4 to 6 weeks for American vessels. Iron ore, coal, and grain that would normally move through January and February, now stranded until spring thaw. 4 to 6 weeks of lost shipping capacity on the most critical commercial waterway in North America. It's not a weapon anyone had to build. It's not a weapon that required legislation or military deployment. It's a weapon that forms every December when the temperature drops below freezing and the ice thickens across 400 miles of open water. And the icebreakers that determine whether those shipping channels stay open. The only machines capable of keeping the upper lakes navigable through a Great Lakes winter fly the Canadian flag. The fourth countermeasure was quieter, but equally consequential. Canada controls significant hydroelectric generation on the Niagara River, the St. Lawrence River, and the connecting channels between the lakes. These aren't small installations. The Niagara generating stations alone produce enough electricity to power over 1 million homes. The St. Lawrence power facilities are critical to the grid in upstate New York and northeastern Ontario. Minor adjustments to water flow, framed publicly as seasonal water resource management consistent with environmental obligations, reduce power output at shared generating facilities. American communities in upstate New York, western Pennsylvania, and across the Great Lakes region that depend on this hydroelectric power face supply uncertainty and immediate price increases projected at 8 to 12%. Canada didn't cut the power. They adjusted the flow, and the lights in Buffalo, Rochester, and Erie flickered. Just enough to notice, just enough to worry, just enough to remind everyone who controls the water that generates the electricity. Carney's public statement was measured, legal, and devastating in its simplicity. For 116 years, the Great Lakes have been governed by the principle that shared water means shared authority. The executive order issued by the President of the United States unilaterally violates that principle. The Boundary Waters Treaty and Canadian sovereignty. Canada's response is simple. We will exercise our sovereign rights over our own waterways, our own locks, our own icebreakers, and our own environmental authority. The Great Lakes belong to both nations. They will not be claimed by one. And then Warren Buffett weighed in with an assessment that stripped away the diplomatic language and explained in the clearest possible terms why this executive order may be the most self-defeating trade action in modern American history. Buffett, who owns BNSF Railway, one of the largest freight networks in North America, whose operations depend on Great Lakes shipping as a complementary transportation system, spoke with the authority of someone who moves more cargo across the American heartland than virtually anyone alive. In 70 years of investing, he said, I have learned that you can change a lot of things. You can change tax policy, you can change regulations, you can change trade agreements, but you cannot change geography. The Great Lakes are where they are. The seaway runs through Canada. The sandlocks sit on the border. Canadian icebreakers keep the channels open in winter. These are physical facts, and no executive order in history has ever overridden a physical fact, he continued. The President signed an order claiming priority over shared waterways. Canada responded by exercising sovereignty over the parts of those waterways they actually control. Geography decided who wins that confrontation before either side said a word. Buffett then walked through the supply chain implications with the precision of a man who has spent decades understanding how physical goods move through physical space, along physical routes that no policy can reroute. I own a railroad. I understand supply chains better than most people in government. And I can tell you that the Great Lakes Seaway System is not a convenience for the American Midwest. It is the foundation. It is the thing upon which everything else is built. 80% of American iron ore moves through the SO locks. If those locks slow down, steel production slows down. If steel production slows down, auto manufacturing slows down, construction slows down, defense contracting slows down, appliance manufacturing slows down. The cascade is immediate, it's physical, and it is not something you can root around with a clever policy or an alternative supplier. He elaborated on the irreplaceability of the Great Lakes route with the specificity of someone who has modeled these logistics for his own business. There is no alternative to the Great Lakes for moving iron ore from Minnesota to the steel mills at the volume required. Let me be very clear about this. You cannot truck that volume of iron ore from the Mesabi Range to Gary, Indiana. The highways cannot handle it, and the cost per ton makes steel production uneconomic. You cannot rail all of it. There isn't enough rail capacity between the Iron Range and the lower lakes, and even if there were, the cost would add $40 to $60 per ton to every batch of steel produced. The lakes are the only economically viable route for the volume of iron ore that American steel production requires, and the President just antagonized the country that controls half of those lakes and all of the exit to the Atlantic. Then he said something about the treaty that should be required reading for everyone in the administration. The Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909 is one of the most successful international agreements in modern history. It is a masterpiece of practical diplomacy. For 116 years, it has kept the world's largest freshwater system peaceful, productive, and shared. It survived 2 world wars. It survived the Great Depression. It survived the Cold War, when these 2 countries had nuclear weapons pointed at the same enemies, and still managed to share a lake system without incident. It survived every trade dispute, every border disagreement, every political tension between the United States and Canada for over a century. That treaty exists because the people who wrote it understood something that apparently needs to be relearned in Washington. When you share a resource this critical, this physically interconnected, this impossible to divide, the only stable arrangement is mutual respect and equal access. The moment one side claims priority, the other side has every right and every incentive to use their geographic leverage in response. That's not theory, That's what just happened. The president didn't just violate a treaty, he violated the logic behind the treaty, and Canada's response demonstrates exactly why that logic has endured for 116 years. His verdict landed with the finality of a closing bell. The most expensive mistakes in business are the ones where you misunderstand your own dependencies. This president looked at the Great Lakes and saw an asset to claim. He should have looked at the Great Lakes and seen a shared system that works precisely because neither side tries to dominate it. You cannot executive order your way past geography. Geography doesn't negotiate. Geography doesn't fold. Geography is permanent. The fallout across the American Midwest has been immediate, and it's accelerating. Iron ore shipments through the Solocks are backing up. The 30 to 40% capacity reduction on the Canadian Channel means vessels are queuing for hours, sometimes days, at Sault Ste. Marie. Steel mills in Gary, Indiana, are already reporting delivery delays that have forced partial production slowdowns. Cleveland-Cliffs, the largest iron ore producer in North America, issued a statement warning that sustained disruption to Great Lakes shipping will result in significant production curtailments across our steelmaking operations. U.S. Steel has put workers on rotating furloughs at 2 facilities while they wait for raw material deliveries that are sitting in port 200 miles away. The automotive industry is next in line. Ford, GM, and Stellantis all operate plants on both sides of the Great Lakes. Parts that used to cross freely between Windsor and Detroit, between Ontario and Michigan, between Canadian suppliers and American assembly lines, are now subject to the same seaway slowdowns and inspection delays affecting all Great Lakes commerce. The just-in-time delivery system that modern auto manufacturing depends on doesn't have a buffer for 48-hour transit delays. When a stamping plant in Ontario can't get parts to an assembly line in Michigan on schedule, the assembly line stops. When the assembly line stops, workers go home. Michigan, the heart of American auto manufacturing, the state with the most direct dependence on Great Lakes shipping, the state that Trump won by fewer than 11,000 votes, is becoming ground zero for the consequences of this executive order. Agriculture is bleeding too. Grain from Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, and the Dakotas that would normally be moving through the seaway to global markets is stacking up at ports in Duluth and Thunder Bay. The seaway slowdowns don't distinguish between iron ore and wheat. Everything transiting the Canadian-controlled locks faces the same enhanced inspection and review protocols. International buyers who had contracted for American wheat and corn deliveries are now facing delays that trigger penalty clauses in their contracts and spoilage risk for perishable shipments sitting in holds that weren't designed for extended storage. And here's the part that should terrify American farmers. Asian and European grain importers, already nervous about American trade reliability after months of tariff chaos, supply disruptions, and broken commitments, are actively signaling they may shift purchases to Australian, Brazilian, and Argentine suppliers who can actually deliver on schedule. A Japanese trading house that had contracted for 400,000 metric tons of American wheat issued a force majeure notice this week, citing seaway transit uncertainty. A European flour mill consortium rerouted its next quarter's purchases to Australian suppliers who can ship through the Indian Ocean without touching a single Canadian lock. American farmers grow it. American trucks move it to Duluth. Great Lakes freighters are supposed to carry it to the seaway and out to the world. And now the seaway is backed up because the president tried to claim priority over water that isn't his. The grain is sitting in port. The contracts are expiring. The buyers are calling South America. And the farmers in Minnesota, in Wisconsin, in Iowa, in North Dakota are watching a year's harvest sit in elevators while the president fights over shipping lanes with the country that controls the only exit to the ocean. Energy costs across the Great Lakes region are climbing. The hydroelectric adjustments on the Niagara and St. Lawrence are reducing power output to American communities. Coal shipments by lake freighter, still a significant power source for communities across the Midwest, are subject to the same transit delays affecting everything else on the system. Energy analysts project an 8 to 12% increase in electricity costs across the Great Lakes states within 60 days if the disruptions continue. And the political map of this damage should terrify every strategist in the White House. The states most directly impacted by Great Lakes disruption are Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Wisconsin, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, New York, and Illinois. That's not a random list. That is the industrial heartland of the United States. That is the region that decides presidential elections. Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, the 3 states that decided both the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections. The 3 states where margins are measured in thousands of votes, not millions, are all Great Lakes states with economies that depend directly on the waterway system Trump just disrupted. Michigan's entire auto industry cannot function without Great Lakes shipping. Wisconsin's agricultural exports cannot reach global markets without seaway access. Pennsylvania's steel sector and its Great Lakes port at Erie are directly impacted by every slowdown on the system. Ohio and Indiana are competitive or Republican-leaning states with massive Great Lakes industrial economies. The steel mills in Gary and Cleveland employ tens of thousands of workers whose jobs depend on iron ore arriving on schedule through the SOLOCs. Minnesota's Iron Range, the source of that iron ore, is watching its products sit in port while channels are restricted. Steel workers in Gary, auto workers in Detroit, farmers in Wisconsin, miners in Minnesota, energy consumers in Buffalo. These aren't coastal elites. These aren't Wall Street traders. These are factory workers, steel workers, farmers, and auto workers in the American heartland. His people, his voters, his states, and they're feeling it right now. Republican governors in Ohio and Indiana have already issued statements expressing deep concern about the economic impact of unilateral trade actions on Great Lakes commerce. The governor of Michigan, regardless of party, has called for the executive order to be rescinded immediately, citing catastrophic risk to Michigan's manufacturing economy. When Republican governors start publicly questioning a Republican president's executive order, when they choose their states over their party, the political ground is shifting beneath the administration's feet. These governors aren't making ideological arguments, they're making survival arguments. Their states' economies run on those lakes. Their voters' paychecks depend on iron ore arriving on time, parts crossing the lakes on schedule, and grain reaching export markets without penalty-triggering delays. And all of it is slowing down because one man signed one order claiming sovereignty over water that belongs to both nations. So here's where we stand. Trump signed an executive order claiming American priority over Great Lakes shipping. 6 provisions that violate the Boundary Waters Treaty. Ignore Canadian sovereignty. Attempt to seize unilateral control over the most critical shared waterway system on Earth, and include a resource transit provision that international lawyers are calling state-sponsored piracy. Canada responded in 48 hours with geographic leverage that no executive order can override, seaway slowdowns costing the Midwest an estimated $340 million per month. SOLOCs restrictions choking the iron ore supply to American steel mills, icebreaker reprioritization, threatening to shorten the winter shipping season by 4 to 6 weeks, and hydroelectric adjustments raising energy costs across the Great Lakes region. The Midwest is bleeding, steel mills are slowing, auto plants are disrupted, grain is stacking up in port while international buyers redirect their purchases to South America and Australia, energy costs are climbing, and every state that decides American presidential elections is feeling the consequences in real time. The Great Lakes have been shared for 116 years because the alternative, one side trying to dominate, makes both sides worse off. The treaty wasn't sentimental, it was pragmatic. It was written by leaders who understood that shared water works when it's shared and breaks catastrophically when one side grabs. Trump looked at the Great Lakes and saw something to take. He should have seen something to protect. Because the moment he tried to force American priority over shared waters, he gave Canada every reason and every legal right to remind him whose locks, whose icebreakers, and whose channels make the entire system work. The iron ore is sitting in port at Sault Ste. Marie. The grain is stacking up at Duluth. The auto parts are delayed between Windsor and Detroit. The steel mills in Gary are slowing production. The farmers in Minnesota are watching a year's work sit in elevators. And the icebreakers that will determine whether the upper lakes stay open this winter fly the Canadian flag. Geography doesn't negotiate. Geography doesn't fold. Geography is permanent. And the Great Lakes, the shared resource that has kept the Midwest economy running for over a century, just reminded the President of the United States that you cannot force a deal over water that isn't yours.